Howdy ESSM 406. There's one more issue I want to talk to you about in regards to this unit. This unit, Unit 2, is all about the sources of environmental problems. And I've given you these, what did I say, 4 sources, right? What are they? There are externalities, common pool resources, public goods, and social justice concerns. And most environmental problems, pretty much all environmental problems, are at least one of those. Some of them can be multiple, but they're at least one of those. But when we talk about environmental problems, we often do not make our decisions based on whether or not this or that would be the most efficient way to do it. Why not? Well, it helps to think about an issue that isn't the environment. Let's think about slavery, right? Many 150 years ago, slavery, a little more than 150 years ago, slavery was legal in Texas, right? Black people could be owned as slaves. And in fact, many black people in Texas were owned as slaves. And I'm a white person. I could go to the market and I could buy a black person. And I could do literally whatever I wanted to that person, and that was legal. Now you say, oh, that was horrible. That was morally wrong, right? Well, it may have been economically efficient. As long as we are in that system and we don't think of those people as being people, which they didn't. I mean, those people were slaves. They weren't people. Then there's nothing wrong about it. It's a very economically efficient system. And in fact, we found that the economy of the southern cotton growing economy of the antebellum United States was a thriving economic enterprise. Huge economic growth happening, in part as a result of this system. So what's wrong with it? Well, it's morally wrong. That's not one of the kinds of arguments I just told you about, right? And these are the really important arguments that we need to be paying attention to. And when people make an argument, you're never going to hear a politician say, well, we need to fund our military because it's a public good. No, they're going to say, we need to fund our military because they defend us against these threats, and there's Al-Qaeda and whatever the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and here's the evidence. And then someone else is going to get up and say, no, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria is not our problem. We shouldn't be fighting there. We shouldn't be spending money on that because it's wrong to interfere in the affairs of other countries. None of this is about this kind of economic model, right? And when people say, oh, we need to save the environment, they say, oh, well, we need to save the forests because they're a common pool resource. No one ever says that. They say, the forests are beautiful and they're our heritage and we love the forest and save the animals and save the wildlife, right? So we have all these really kind of technical ways we can think about it, and I want you to learn to think in all those ways. But when we look at the kinds of arguments people make, sometimes they are saying this, but they're saying it in different ways. They might find a more poetic way to say that this is a common pool resource or this is a public good. But oftentimes they're saying something else. They're making an emotional appeal. They're making a rhetorical appeal. And we need to pay attention to what are they saying? What are the morals that they're calling for? What are the values that they're calling us to take? And so the last part of the essay assignment that I gave you, the last thing I'm going to evaluate you on is, have you analyzed what the policy is actually making the decision on? Is the Endangered Species a law about the Endangered Species Act, a law about common pool resources or public goods or externalities? Or is it a law about our obligations, our moral obligations to other animals? Well, it probably depends on whom you ask. But I recommend those of you who are learning about the Endangered Species Act should all go and check out a place called the Center for Biological Diversity. It's based out in Arizona, although I think it's grown. And they don't say we need to protect natural endangered species because it's a common pool resource problem. They say this is a moral issue about our obligation to other beings, right? And even when people speak about economic development, they don't say, well, this is efficient, blah 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 economics. They say, no, we need to make our society more prosperous. We'll live better lives if we have more money, right? That's what it's about. So I want you learn to be very analytical and use these terms, use these concepts that I'm teaching you in this unit. But I also want you to pay attention to the rhetoric that people use, because you'll often find it's different than these models. And what can we do with this rhetoric? Well, first of all, when we look at the rhetoric, we might find that they're not quite saying what they really, maybe they're stretching the truth, maybe they're confusing the moral issue and the political issue. But sometimes we might find that, this would be better when we do the economic analysis, but we're never going to convince these people about it. Maybe we need to fight them, or maybe we need to get these moral arguments on our side. In the case of the slavery example I started this lecture with, we had to fight a war to end slavery, right? The northern states had to send an army. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people died over this issue. I mean, yeah, I know maybe there were other causes of the Civil War, etc. But basically it was about whether or not there'd be slavery in the southern states. And we had to fight a war about it. So it's good to have these technical groundings, but you need to be able to recognize that ultimately we don't make decisions based on technical analysis. And in the future units, we'll also talk about how making decisions is a political act. But for now, I just want you to say making decisions is a rhetorical and a moral act. And these analytic tools will help us understand the rhetoric and the morals, sometimes help us poke some holes in the rhetoric and the morals that different people have. But it ultimately is going to come down to rhetoric and morals and decision-making processes.